The first sound I heard at my husband's funeral wasn't a sob. It was the soft, satisfied click of my daughter-in-law's designer handbag closing, as the pastor droned on about eternal rest from the pulpit of the old stone church. Beatrice leaned over, her breath a cold whisper of expensive perfume and triumph against my ear. "Enjoy the front row, Eleanor," she murmured, her voice a silken thread of malice. "It's the last thing of Arthur's you'll ever have." She thought she was delivering an epitaph for my life, the final dismissive word on my chapter in the Vance family history. She had no idea I was the one about to lower her into the grave. The air in the chapel, perched on a bluff overlooking the slate-gray Atlantic, was heavy with the scent of sea salt and wilting gardenias. It was a smell that promised decay, clinging to the dark wood of the pews and the black wool of our coats. The room was filled with the notable figures of our small New England town: shipbuilders, old-money families, colleagues from Vance Maritime Solutions, and distant relatives who materialized for deaths and weddings with the same opportunistic timing as gulls following a fishing boat. I sat ramrod straight, my gloved hands clutching a silk handkerchief, my wedding band a dull weight on my finger. Arthur's casket, made of polished mahogany that gleamed like dark water, lay before the altar. Beside it, a photograph of him in his prime, a handsome man with the sea in his eyes, smiling as if he'd never known a storm. The collective murmur of the congregation hushed as the pastor began his eulogy, but I felt Beatrice's gaze burning into the side of my face. She was a vision in a severe black dress that showcased her figure more than her grief. Her crimson lipstick was flawless, untouched by tears she had no intention of shedding. She had been waiting for this day, for the moment Arthur's formidable presence was reduced to a memory she could edit, a legacy she could claim. Her whisper had been meant to break me, to land like a perfectly aimed stone in the quiet pool of my sorrow. She expected me to flinch, to crumble. I did not. Before I could form a response, a pair of Arthur's old sailing buddies approached, their faces etched with genuine sadness to offer their condolences. Beatrice intercepted them, her expression shifting instantly to one of tragic ownership. She placed a hand on one of their arms, her voice now pitched for public consumption. "Finally," she sighed, with a theatrical little shake of her head. "It's ours to manage. The responsibility is just immense." The two men paused, their sympathetic gazes flickering from her poised performance to my impassive face. Confusion clouded their eyes. One of them squeezed my hand, a gesture of pity that felt more insulting than comforting, before they retreated. The pastor faltered, his voice catching for a split second before he found his rhythm again. A casket can command a room's silence, but spite, I've learned, has a resonance all its own. Then came the second blow, a whisper I will carry with me forever. My granddaughter, Lily, all of 10 years old, leaned against me, her small voice parroting the venom she'd been taught to drink like milk. "Grandma," she said, her tone one of simple, factual recitation, "Mommy says you're not really a Vance anymore." There was no cruelty in her delivery, only the innocent echo of a carefully planted idea. I turned to look at the child, her face a miniature version of her mother's, and saw the future they had meticulously designed for me. A slow fade into irrelevance. My name scraped off the family mailbox. My presence erased from the grand narrative they were so eager to write. I pressed my lips into a bloodless line, my hand tightening on the handkerchief until my knuckles ached. Across the aisle, Arthur's sister stared determinedly at the stained glass window depicting a ship in a storm, her denial a form of passive complicity. The whispers grew around me, pitying glances and averted eyes painting a portrait of the broken widow, the discarded matriarch. They believed the story Beatrice had spent years crafting, that Arthur Vance, the brilliant founder of Vance Maritime Solutions, was a self-made titan, and I, Eleanor, was merely the decorative wife who hosted his dinner parties. They had forgotten, or perhaps had been convinced to forget, that I was the one who stood beside him on the docks when all we owned was a leaky boat and a mountain of debt. I was the one who taught myself maritime law from dusty library books, who drafted the first contracts on a second-hand typewriter in our damp basement apartment. I was the one who pawned my own mother's pearls to make payroll during the recession of '87. Those truths had been systematically buried, replaced by a more convenient fiction. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the cloying scent of the gardenias turning metallic in my throat. I squeezed the handkerchief, feeling the embroidered AE I'd stitched into the corner a lifetime ago. Beatrice smirked from her seat, a silent dare for me to stand and make a fool of myself. I remained seated. My rebuttal was not meant for a church. It was meant for a courtroom. They thought this was the day my world ended. They were wrong. It was the day I took it back. I was 22, with a degree in history from Wellesley, when I met Arthur Vance. My path was set: a doctorate, a professorship, a life spent in quiet archives deciphering the stories of the past. Then I met him, a man who smelled of salt and ambition, who spoke not of history, but of the future he was going to build. He had an idea for a company that would supply the finest parts and navigation technology to the shipyards dotting the New England coast. He had the passion, but he lacked the structure, the meticulous attention to detail that turns a dream into an enterprise. When he asked me to join him, to leave my academic ambitions behind, I saw it not as a sacrifice, but as a chance to build a history of our own. I became his partner in every sense of the word. While he charmed investors and forged relationships on the docks, I built the company's foundations. I was the bookkeeper, the contract negotiator, the one who spent sleepless nights poring over ledgers, ensuring every dollar was accounted for. Our first office was a cramped room above a fish market, the air thick with the smell of the harbor. "We built this together, Ellie," he'd say, his hand covering mine over a stack of invoices. And in those early years, his family saw it too. His parents welcomed me, celebrated my contributions. My place at their table was not just secure, it was honored. But fortunes change people, and they change how stories are told. When our son Julian brought Beatrice home, she was a whirlwind of sophisticated charm and ruthless ambition. She came from a family where legacy was measured in stock portfolios, not in calloused hands. At first, she was deferential, even admiring. But soon, the subtle edits to our history began. At parties, she would introduce Arthur as the singular visionary, the lone architect of his success, while I stood smiling beside him, relegated to the role of silent, supportive spouse. The first time, I dismissed it. The second, it stung. The third time, I heard her telling a friend, "Oh, Eleanor, she was a wonderful homemaker. Arthur built the entire empire himself." The true poison, however, came from a lie so insidious it took root and strangled everything. Beatrice began circulating a rumor among the extended family that during a financial downturn years ago, I had gambled away a significant investment on a risky side venture that nearly sank the company. The truth was the opposite. I had used my own inheritance, a modest sum left by my parents, to quietly bail the company out, a fact I had never revealed to anyone but Arthur, to protect his pride. But Beatrice's version was more dramatic, more fitting for the narrative she was creating. Soon, the warmth from Arthur's relatives cooled to a polite frost. Invitations dwindled. My role in the family became ceremonial, a ghost at the feast. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. When Beatrice left her high-powered marketing job after Lily was born, she was hailed as a saint making the ultimate sacrifice for her family. When I had given up my entire career to build one from the ground up, I was simply lucky to have married a successful man. Julian, my own son, began to echo her rhetoric. "Dad was the genius, Mom," he said one night at dinner, completely oblivious to the wound he was inflicting. "You were the one who made sure the home fires were burning." I stopped correcting them. I stopped reminding them of the all-nighters, The legal battles I'd fought, the contracts I'd saved. Beatrice had become the official historian, and her version was the only one that mattered. But a historian knows that some truths are not found in public records. They are tucked away in private letters, in signed documents, in the quiet certainty of a safe deposit box. And as I sat in that cold church, I knew the archives were about to be opened. When Arthur's health began its slow, cruel decline, I moved into Julian and Beatrice's sterile, modern house on the hill. It wasn't an invitation born of love, but a transaction of convenience. "You can help out, Mom," Julian had said, avoiding my eyes. "Just keep the house running." What he meant was that I would become their unpaid, invisible servant. My days fell into a grueling routine. I cooked meals they rarely complimented, did laundry they carelessly discarded, scrubbed floors, and managed Lily's complicated schedule. I ate my dinners standing at the kitchen counter, picking at leftovers after they had finished. Beatrice never once said, "Sit with us, Eleanor." My presence at the table would have disrupted the aesthetic. Her cruelty was a masterpiece of subtlety. If I bought a new sweater, she would comment, "That's a rather bright color for your age, don't you think?" She preferred me in muted grays and beiges, the colors of the background. The final, shattering humiliation came during one of her networking parties. The house was filled with people whose names were attached to hedge funds and tech startups. I had spent 2 days preparing hors d'oeuvres, my hands raw from chopping and stirring. As I moved through the living room collecting empty champagne flutes, a man in a tailored suit stopped me. He smiled a polite, dismissive smile. "You do a wonderful job," he said, gesturing around the pristine room. "Are you the live-in housekeeper?" The ambient chatter of the party faded to a dull roar in my ears. I looked toward Beatrice, who had overheard. I saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes as she tilted her head. "Oh, that's just Eleanor," she said with a light, airy laugh. "Arthur's mother. She just loves to help out." She didn't correct him. She validated his assumption. The casualness of the dismissal was like a blade to the heart. The man nodded, his assessment of me confirmed, and moved on. I stood there, holding the delicate glasses, my face a frozen mask. It was in that moment that something within me hardened, transforming from grief into glacial resolve. I realized then the profound power of being underestimated. If they saw only a frail old woman in a faded cardigan, they would never see the final move until it was too late. Later that night, Julian found me in the kitchen. "Beatrice thinks it's better if you don't mingle at these things," he mumbled, scrolling through his phone. "You know, you might make her guests uncomfortable." Uncomfortable with what? I thought. The truth. The history of this family that paid for his expensive shoes and his wife's champagne. I was the foundation of the house they were living in, silent and unseen, until someone decided to tear it down. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought of something Arthur used to say in our early days. "Never show them your whole hand, Ellie, until the pot is big enough to win." The pot was my life's work, my dignity. It was more than big enough. A week later, I chose my moment. After dinner, I brought out a small velvet box. Inside lay my grandmother's diamond ring, an heirloom that had survived the Depression and a world war. It was a symbol of the resilience of the women in my family. "Beatrice," I began, my voice even, "I would like you to have this. It represents a legacy of strength." She opened the box, her eyes scanning the antique setting with blatant disinterest. She closed the lid and pushed it back across the table. "Thank you, Eleanor, but it's dreadfully old-fashioned," she said, her tone final. "It belongs in a museum, not on my hand." The rejection was not of the ring, but of the history it represented. That night, I went to the small, locked chest in my closet. Inside, Nestled beneath old photographs was the real will Arthur had signed in the hospital, witnessed by his oldest and most trusted attorney. Beside it lay the original partnership agreement for Vance Maritime Solutions, with my name listed as co-founder. And there was a letter, written in Arthur's shaky but determined hand, a letter he'd given me 2 weeks before he died. "They will try to erase you," he had written. "Don't let them. The truth is our anchor, Ellie. Hold fast." I held the papers, the tangible proof of my life, and I made my decision. I once saved this family from financial ruin, I whispered into the silent room. Now, I would save myself from oblivion. The groundwork had been laid weeks before the funeral. The morning after Beatrice's casual cruelty at the party, I made a call to Alistair Finch, Arthur's personal attorney for over 40 years. He was a man of quiet integrity who knew where every dollar was earned and every secret was buried. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with recognition, "I've been waiting for your call." In his dusty, leather-bound office, he laid it all out. The final will was ironclad. Arthur had left the entirety of his estate, his controlling shares in the company, the house, and all liquid assets, a sum totaling just shy of $10 million to me. "The prenuptial agreement protects everything you built together," Alistair explained. "They can contest it, but it would be a fool's errand. The will is explicit." My instructions were simple. I want all assets frozen, no transfers, no sales, not a single penny moves until after the reading of the will. Back in their house, I moved like a phantom, my grief a perfect cover for my purpose. While Beatrice was ordering funeral wreaths and Julian was accepting condolences, I was quietly gathering evidence. I went through the home office, retrieving every document that bore my signature. Original company bylaws, old tax filings, deeds to properties they had long considered their own. I placed them all in a secure deposit box to which only I had the key. It took them 4 days to realize something was amiss. "Mom," Julian asked at the dinner table, his tone laced with forced casualness, "have you seen the share certificates? They're not in the main safe." I dabbed my lips with my napkin. "I've put all important documents somewhere safe," I replied calmly. Beatrice's fork stilled. "Somewhere safe? Where?" she pressed, her mask of civility slipping. I met her gaze across the polished mahogany table. "Just safe," I said. And a new kind of silence, cold and heavy, descended on the room. That night, I heard them whispering outside my door. "She's hiding them," Beatrice hissed. "She's planning something." They were right, but their imaginations were far too small for what was coming. The first domino fell over a piece of commercial property they called the Wharfside Warehouse, a valuable asset I had personally negotiated the purchase of 3 decades ago. I overheard Beatrice on the phone, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. She was planning to sell it quickly and quietly, funneling the money to her feckless brother Sebastian for some dubious tech startup. "Eleanor won't even notice," she'd scoffed. "She thinks it's just some old building." That afternoon I visited a small copy shop and faxed a single-page document to the county records office, the bank holding the deed, and the realtor Beatrice had secretly engaged. The document was a legal notice of dispute, citing my ownership as co-founder under the original corporate charter and my rights under the prenuptial agreement. By 3 o'clock, the calls started. At 5, Sebastian himself called me, sputtering with rage. "You've killed the deal. Do you know what you've cost me?" I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "I believe the question," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, "is what were you trying to steal from me?" 2 days later, they called an emergency family meeting. It was a pathetic tribunal held in their dining room with Beatrice acting as prosecutor. "She's sabotaging us," she declared, her voice trembling with theatrical fury. She filed a legal dispute on the warehouse for no reason. Alistair Finch, whom I had invited, cleared his throat. "If I may clarify a point of law," he began, opening a file. "The property in question was acquired during the marriage and, as per the corporate charter, requires the signature of both founding partners for its sale. As Mrs. Vance has not provided her consent, any attempted sale would, in fact, be fraudulent." Julian's face went pale. Beatrice stared at Alistair, then at me, the dawning horror in her eyes, a sight to behold. They had lived so long with their fictional history that they had forgotten the legal reality. I sat through the rest of their blustering, my hands folded in my lap. The fear had finally taken root. It wasn't the fear of losing money. It was the fear of a narrative collapsing, of a truth they had tried to bury, clawing its way back into the light. After the final hymn at the funeral faded, just as people began to stir, Alistair Finch walked to the front of the church. A ripple of confusion went through the congregation. Laura's expression, however, morphed into one of smug certainty. She believed this was a formality before her coronation. "My name is Alistair Finch," he announced, his voice echoing in the hallowed space. "I am the attorney for the late Arthur Vance. As per his final written instructions, I am to read his last will and testament here, today, to prevent any and all future disputes." Laura sat up straighter, a triumphant gleam in her eye. Alistair began to read. "I, Arthur Wallace Vance, being of sound mind." He started with a few minor bequests to charities and distant relatives. Then he paused, and the church held its breath. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor Vance," he continued, his gaze steady, "for being the co-founder of my company, the architect of my life, and the keeper of our truth, I leave the entirety of my estate. This includes my controlling shares in Vance Maritime Solutions, all personal and real properties, and all liquid assets, totaling $9,800,000. A collective gasp swept the room. It wasn't a whisper. It was the sound of 100 people's reality shifting at once. I saw Julian's face drain of all color, his skin turning the shade of ash. Alistair continued, his voice unwavering. "To my son, Julian Vance, and his wife, Beatrice Vance, I leave my deepest hope that they will one day learn that legacy is built on truth, and respect is the only inheritance that truly matters. All other assets not specified are to remain under the sole control of Eleanor Vance, to be distributed at her discretion." Beatrice shot to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief. "This is a mistake!" she cried out, her voice shrill and ugly in the sacred silence. "There's another will. Arthur promised." Alistair looked at her, his expression devoid of pity. "This is the only legally recognized will, signed by Mr. Vance 3 months ago. Any other document you possess is null and void." I rose then, my movements slow and deliberate. Every eye was on me. "Arthur was right," I said, my voice clear and strong, carrying to the back of the church. "Respect is the real inheritance. A home is not built from stone and wood, but from loyalty and honor. And for some time now, those things have been in desperately short supply in my family." The air was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. I saw my granddaughter, Lily, looking from her mother's contorted face to my calm one, her young mind struggling to reconcile the two realities. I walked to the front, my heels clicking on the stone floor. "What you inherit in money can be spent," I said, addressing the room. "What you inherit in reputation can be lost in an instant." Beatrice's face was now blotchy with rage. "We took care of him," she spat. "We were there." "Yes," I answered quietly. "You were there. While I cooked the meals, ran the house, and allowed you to play the roles of devoted son and daughter-in-law, without ever having to trouble yourselves with the business that paid for it all." The room was utterly still. Alistair closed his folder with a quiet snap. As I walked back down the aisle, I passed my son, You planned this, he whispered, his voice choked with accusation. I stopped and leaned in close. No, Julian, I corrected him. I protected what was mine. There is a profound difference. Outside, the cold January air was a relief. As the other mourners filed out, many of them, the ones who remembered the early days, squeezed my hand. Good for you, Eleanor, one said. Arthur would be so proud. I saw Beatrice and Julian standing on the church steps, isolated in their shared defeat. They looked like statues of fury and shame. They didn't approach me. They no longer had the right. I never returned to their house. Within weeks, I sold off several commercial properties and used the funds to establish the Eleanor Vance Grant for Historical Preservation, a scholarship for women seeking to uncover and preserve truths that others have tried to bury. I bought a small, sun-drenched cottage by the sea, filled it with books, and for the first time in decades, I lived in a silence that was truly peaceful. Beatrice called once, her voice strained, attempting a rehearsed apology. I listened patiently before I spoke. Apologies are only meaningful when the person offering them understands what they've done wrong, Beatrice. You are only sorry you were caught. I hung up. People ask if it felt good to win. It was never about winning. It was about reclamation. It was about ensuring that the history I helped build would not be erased by those who simply wanted to inherit the glory without understanding the struggle. They thought that funeral was my burial. They didn't realize that I was the one holding the shovel all along. True legacy isn't an inheritance you're given. It's the truth you refuse to let die. And sometimes, that truth is a quiet, steady lighthouse, obscured by the fog of lies, but standing tall, waiting for the storm to finally break.